So thanks everyone for tuning in again. So this week it's Professor Robert Dryfe from the University of Manchester. So I met Rob probably at conferences a long time ago, but officially I met him. He was my external examiner for my own PhD back in 2009 when I was at the Tyndall National Institute in Cork. And Rob has many diverse interests. One of them is liquid electrochemistry, more towards maybe earlier in his career, and now he's an expert, as he'll talk about today, on carbon and carbon electrolyte interface electrochemistry. So really looking forward to your talk, Rob, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Michal, for the introduction. And yeah, the title, as you can see, is the carbon electrolyte interface, and hopefully this will move on properly. Michal, let me know if it doesn't when I move. So hopefully you can see the outline of the presentation. First thing I'm going to give is a little bit of a background on why we're interested in carbon electrolyte interfaces. The second thing I'm going to talk about is bulk forms of carbon, and that will actually form most of the lecture. I'll talk about the electrochemistry of graphite, and I'm going to talk about our own work, obviously, but I'm going to try and discuss the field a bit more widely, discuss what's been done in the past, and hopefully give you some ideas about where this area is going, in my opinion. And I will talk a little bit about the fashionable, if you like, nanoforms of carbon, which includes graphene. And I don't think, unfortunately, we're still doing liquid electrochemistry, slightly contrary to what Michal just said, but so the liquid electrochemistry flag is still being flown in Manchester. But unfortunately, I don't think today I will have time to move on to liquid electrochemistry, unfortunately, maybe next time. So just a bit of background. So why carbon? Why are we interested in carbon electrode materials? And well, I think it's fairly obvious if you think about it for a second that carbon really is or different types of carbons are really the workhorse materials in electrochemistry. First of all, we have metals as kind of the more, if you like, prominent electrode materials. Electrocatalysis is obviously a very important area of science at the moment. People are interested in new electrochemical ways to convert interesting feedstocks into interesting energy carriers. And metals are basically, especially noble metals and certain metal oxides as well, are typically the materials that do that job. And that field was really revolutionized because in the 1980s, with the development of single crystal electrochemistry, the fact that people could take single crystals, well-defined model single crystal surfaces, and understand the electrochemical properties of those single crystal metal faces and relate the structure of the metal to its electroactivity. That was a really important development, because the problem is that most real electrode materials, most nanoparticle catalysts or whatever that are used in a fuel cell, have got a very complex morphology. So we need somewhere to start from. And that's dealing with metals. If we do the same kind of analysis with carbon materials, okay, carbons aren't used so much as electrocatalysts, so there is more work coming out on what's called carbocatalysis with doped carbons and so on. But really, carbons are more used in the catalytic context as the support for the metals that do the catalytic job. And the carbons also find other applications in energy conversion and storage. Carbons, of course, are used in batteries, in the lithium-ion battery, for example. The anode is a graphite material, and the cathode, although the active material is a metal oxide, the cathode always contains some kind of carbon, a carbon black, or even nanotubes or graphene to increase the conductivity of that material. And then supercapacitors, obviously, commercial supercapacitors are formed from high surface area activated carbon materials. Now, if we move to the field of electroanalysis, most of the electrodes used in electroanalysis are some kind of screen printed carbon or again, high surface area carbon. So there's lots of diverse types of carbon materials that are used in various applications. So probably by kind of bulk application or by volume, carbons are probably the most widely used single electrode material. But the problem is all these examples that I've talked about, whether we're talking about in the context of screen printed carbons in electroanalysis or graphite powders, or even activated carbons, so used in batteries and supercapacitors respectively, all those materials have got complicated even the chemical structure, because it's very rare that they're 100% carbon atoms. So there'll always be some, or usually be some oxygen content and perhaps some other materials, some other elements present in the nominally carbon material. And more than that, as well as a complex chemical structure, they will have a complex physical structure. All of these materials are porous, heterogeneous materials. So it's quite hard to define, if you like, a model substrate for carbon. If you're starting from these complex materials, it's quite hard to understand the behavior. So what can we consider the simplest kind of model substrate for carbon? And that's where graphite comes in, because obviously that's the conducting form, conducting allotrope of carbon. And graphite's been known for several hundred years. And I guess graphite and the materials derived from graphite have had a big kick over the past 20 or 30 years, basically over the duration of my scientific career so far, because in the 1980s, Buckminster fullerene was discovered. So that's zero-dimensional carbon, if you like. In the 1990s, carbon nanotubes were discovered, or some people would say rediscovered. This is one-dimensional carbon. And then, of course, in the 2000s, in my own university in Manchester, graphene materials were discovered. So this is two-dimensional carbon, all derived from the parent graphite structure. And just because it is going on YouTube, I have taken this figure just to make it clear from this open access journal. So as long as I acknowledge the source of the figure, then I think it's apparently legal because it's an open access journal. I have to say I've never heard of the journal before, but it was a reasonable figure. And the basal plane of graphite, I would argue, we can use as a model electrode surface because it's a well-defined material with a well-defined surface area. So I'm just going to consider in the next couple of slides the kind of state of the art of what's known or what's been studied, discovered over the past couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades, about basal plane graphite. So in terms of the Faradaic electrochemistry of graphite, if you go right back to well, for you young people, if you go right back to the 1990s, a long time ago, before perhaps some of you were born, there was a lot of work from Rick McCreery's group. He was based in the US at the time. He subsequently moved to Canada, and he was looking at, indeed, basal plane graphite, of high quality graphite samples, usually so-called HOPG, highly oriented pyrolytic graphite. So I'll use this acronym from now on, but just to emphasize this means HOPG is highly oriented pyrolytic graphite. And just to summarize the conclusions of his work, he deemed that the basal plane of graphite was actually inert with respect to electron transfer. And the reason that you saw electron transfer on basal plane graphite was because even high quality samples will be defective to some extent. They'll have some sp3 sites or atomic vacancies and so on and so forth. And he concluded that it's these defects that were responsible for the electroactivity of the graphite. Then more recently, this area was revisited by Pat Unwin's group, and they came to basically the opposite conclusion. They decided that concluded that the basal plane of graphite was actually active. And then there was a debate about the relative activity of the basal plane versus the edge plane. And I think now the consensus is that it is less active than the edge plane. But an important thing that came out of Unwin's work, and this is a figure from this paper here, this Jack's paper from 2012, so I've got the requisite copyright statement here, is that when you look at the just standard CV, of course, Unwin's group were using the SECM type techniques that they're very much experts in to probe the local electroactivity of these materials. But when you do a macroscopic CV of, this is a high quality HOPG sample called SPI1, you see a degradation in the CV response as a function of time. You see initially fairly reversible voltammetry, which as you cycle, I think this is probably, if I remember, it's the ferriferrocyanide redox couple, but it's some standard redox couple. I think ferriferrocyanide. The sample, the electrode, if you like, goes off rapidly as the material is cycled. So there was a strong, if you like, contamination of the electrode surface, which interfered with the voltammetry on basal plane graphite. So that's Faradaic electrochemistry. If we look at non-Faradaic electrochemistry of graphite, again, McCreery and Unwin are the two names that stand out in terms of Faradaic electrochemistry. I would say there's two names that stand out in terms of understanding the capacitive behavior of graphite surfaces. And that is the work of Jaeger, going back to the 1970s, and Gerischer during the 1980s and early 90s, I think he worked in this area. So Jaeger looked at the capacitance of graphite in aqueous solutions and found that it was low. It was much lower than you see for metal surfaces. And he kind of rationalized this qualitatively, but a more quantitative analysis had to wait for Gerischer's work, because Gerischer, of course, was an expert in semiconductor electrochemistry. And Gerischer basically used this model, equivalent circuit model, to rationalize the capacitance of graphite. So if there's only one thing you learn about this lecture, I hope the one thing that you'll take away is that graphite is in fact a semi-metal. So that means it has a low density of states near the Fermi level. So that means when you consider the capacitance of the graphite electrolyte interface, if you work at high electrolyte concentration, you can neglect the diffuse double layer capacitance. That term is gone from this equivalent circuit, but you have to still consider a Helmholtz capacitance. And you also have to allow for the space charge capacitance, because you have a relatively, as I said, a relatively low density of states. So you can't ignore the contribution of the solid to the overall capacitance. So Gerrish, I'll come back to this type of diagram, but this is our own attempt to analysing Jaeger's data, or reanalyzing Jaeger's data in terms of the model that Gerrish developed, and I'll explain this in a couple of slides' time. So if we move on, then so I'll briefly summarise the Faradaic and the capacitive behaviour of graphite. And in the context of the Faradaic electrochemistry, I mentioned in particular the sensitivity of graphite surfaces, or the ease with which graphite surfaces can become contaminated in solution environments. And another way of probing that is a completely non-electrochemical way, and that is just through the wetting behavior of graphite. And this has become quite a controversial area in recent years, which might be surprising to some of you. So the image you have here, if you can see it, is a droplet of electrolyte solution on a graphite, again on basal plane graphite, and this is viewed through a microscope. So at the scale bar here, I think is probably 10 microns, and what you're seeing is the pipette at the top here, which is used to inject the electrolyte onto the graphite surface. And the reason you see a reflection is because the graphite, the way we're illuminating it, the graphite acts as a mirror. So this is the mirror image of the droplet you see here, and the mirror image of the pipette. So you can see that the contact angle is, we do these experiments so that we can measure the contact angle of this aqueous droplet of graphite, which I should say is in air. And basically, we measure consistently a contact angle of about 64, something like that, plus or minus 2 degrees for water on graphite in air. Now, you'd think that'd be a very simple experiment and that would be known, that would be an established value, but it's not. If you look in the literature on the contact angle of water and graphite, you can almost find any number that you want. And in fact, a lot of the numbers cluster around 80 or 90 degrees, but I would say a few numbers, including our data more recently, which I would of course say is more reliable, but I'm biased. But there are a few other people who report values more like values we see of about 64 degrees. And why this discrepancy? Why are there so many papers, reputable papers, giving this high value or much higher value for what is quite a simple experiment? You put a droplet on a graphite surface and you measure its contact angle, which should be very simple. And basically, it comes back to the factor I just mentioned. It's the absorption of atmospheric contaminants, because graphite rapidly becomes contaminated with the organic junk that's around us in most urban environments. Then this changes this absorption of hydrocarbons, if you like, and other organic materials, changes the contact angle. And this was well discussed in a Nature Materials paper that came out a few years ago now. So this has been recognized that this phenomenon is responsible for the change in the contact angle of graphite. And this area is become relevant and topical for another reason. That's because people were interested in the contact angle of graphene. And a big question arose, which was, if you put a water droplet on graphene, to what extent is the contact angle of the water dictated by the graphene, and to what extent is it dictated by the substrate underneath the graphene, i.e. to what extent is graphene transparent with respect to contact angle? And this has been quite a hotly debated area, but surprisingly, of course, unsurprisingly, people could only understand the contact angle of graphene once they'd understood the contact angle of graphite. So all these things to say that graphite is susceptible to contamination in aqueous and indeed in air environments. And those contamination effects show up in the wetting behavior and also show up in the voltammetric behavior. And again, now we can move on to some of our own data, which is entirely consistent with the work that I mentioned from Pat Unwin's group. Here we're looking at this is a paper on the voltammetry of graphene, but we also did as an aside in this paper, this is from a few years ago from my group in 2014, we looked at the voltammetry of graphite. And again, it's the similar sort of response that Pat saw, but instead of of looking at repeated cycles of the voltammetry. We're just looking, very simple experiment, we're just looking at the effect of doing CVs with a basic redox couple for a graphite material that's been freshly cleaved, so the basal plane has not been contaminated, or a graphite material that's been aged in the open lab for a while before we do the CV. And you see, if you compare the red CV, the solid red line, with a solid grey line, so this one is fairly reversible, and this one is much less reversible. You see the effect of aging, that's for natural graphite, and you see the same effect for HOPG, which is a synthetic graphite. You see the grey dashed line, fairly reversible CV, and the red dashed line, much less reversible CV, if you let the material age, i.e. if you let these organic contaminants absorb on the basal plane of the graphite. And you can also see this in the XPS response. This is the XPS signal, carbon 1s signal of freshly exfoliated graphite. You see it's dominated by the sp2 carbon. There's only a trace of sp3 carbon, and there's essentially no oxygenated carbon in the SPS signal. Whereas if you leave that material for just a few minutes in a typical laboratory environment, you see bit larger sp3 signal, and also the appearance of a signal due to oxygenated carbons. So these things are all saying the same thing, the XPS and the voltammetry. It's that basal plane graphite gets rapidly contaminated under ambient conditions. And we also see this change in the capacitive response. We're working at high electrolyte concentrations, i.e. using the same trick as Gerischer, so that we can avoid having to worry about double layer capacitance, the diffuse double layer capacitance. We only have to consider the capacitance of the solid and the capacitance of the Helmholtz layer. But you see that the capacitance of the freshly exfoliated graphite, that's what FEG stands for, falls by about 20% over time, which is basically due to this absorption effect of organic materials. Whereas if we leave, it reaches a kind of quasi-steady state after about 40 minutes. Whereas if we take the already aged sample and measure its capacitance, it's pretty stable. It's about 20, it's quite a lot lower, but the value is completely stable because obviously the material has already aged and reached its new kind of equilibrium value. So we can look at, you can see these effects if we look at the potential dependent capacitance. The black symbols are the capacitance as a function of potential for the freshly exfoliated graphite. The red symbols are the capacitance as a function of potential when we let the graphite age in a glove box, and the blue symbols are the capacitance response when we let the graphite age in the open laboratory. So you can see two things. You can see that the capacitance is reduced by the adsorption of this extra layer on the surface, and you can also see that the minimum in the capacitance has moved to more positive potentials, although it's harder to see in the atmospheric age case because the capacitance potential response is shallower. And again, these changes in the capacitance are also mirrored in the changes in the contact angle. We go from a contact angle of 60-something degrees for water on the freshly exfoliated material to 70-something degrees for the material aged in the glove box to 80-something degrees for the material aged in the laboratory. So basically, the take-home message is that basal plane graphite is very susceptible to contamination. So you have to work with it, a freshly exfoliated sample very quickly if you want to be fairly confident that you are indeed looking at the response of a graphite surface and not a graphite surface covered with some rather indeterminate organic monolayer. So going back to the capacitance model that I said that Gerischer developed, by working at a high concentration of electrolyte, he assumed that the capacitance could be considered in terms of only two capacitors in series, the Helmholtz capacitance and the space charge capacitance, which, as I've said, we can't neglect because graphite is a semi-metal. But the question is, obviously, when you do the experiment, you measure these two capacitors in series. So how can you extract these individual capacitance values from the overall experimental capacitance? And Gerischer's elegant, but I would say quite questionable trick was to assume that the Helmholtz, which is he discusses in this JPhys Chem paper from 1987, the one I referred to before, and again, Mihail and YouTube, I've got the requisite copyright statement from the ACS. So what Heinz Gerischer did was to assume that the Helmholtz capacitance for his graphite electrolyte system was the same as the Helmholtz capacitance for a mercury electrolyte system in the same electrolyte. So he swaps his electrode material, but keeps his electrolyte the same and assumes that the Helmholtz capacitance is the same. And then he takes those Helmholtz capacitance values, integrates them to work out the charge in the Helmholtz layer. And then he says, well, I know my total experimental capacitance. The charge stored in the Helmholtz layer should be the same as the charge stored in the solid. So by equating these two charges, I can then work out what the potential drop in the Helmholtz layer is, and therefore what the potential drop in the solid would be. And therefore, once I know those things, I can put the capacitances together and extract the capacitance of the space charge region, the capacitance of the graphite. And that works reasonably well, that procedure. He showed that the data he got agrees reasonably well for theory on the capacitance of the graphite. But as I say, it seems to me, rest on a rather questionable assumption, which is that the Helmholtz capacitance of the mercury, I think the solvent was acetonitrile interface, is the same as the Helmholtz capacitance of the graphite, acetonitrile, or whatever the solvent was, interface. And that seems like a slightly strange assumption to me. So, because if those Helmholtz capacitance were the same, then they wouldn't be sensitive, you wouldn't think, to different ions, because Helmholtz capacitance is all about the absorption of ions, and the absorption of ions on mercury you would expect to be different from the absorption of ions on graphite. And we in fact see, when we've looked at this, we see quite different capacitive responses for different simple alkali metal chloride solutions. You can see at the negative branch of the capacitive response, where the capacitance is dominated by the cation adsorption, you can see that the capacitance response is really sensitive to the identity of the cation. As we go down group 1, as we go down the period, basically the capacitance increases. So that's quite an interesting effect, this kind of specific ion effect on the capacitance of this graphite electrolyte interface. And we can try and analyze that in a very, very naive way. As I said, we're working at high electrolyte concentration, so we can neglect this term, but we can say we have a space charge term and a Helmholtz term in series. And if we plot the reciprocal capacitance against the size of the ion in some way, we should get, we're doing this kind of Parsons-Zobel type analysis, then the gradient of this plot tells us something about the relative permittivity of the water that's in the monolayer of ions absorbed on the surface. And do we get a physically sensible value for the relative permittivity of water in this environment from this very simple plot? And the answer is perhaps, because we get a value of less than 2, which, if you look at the literature in this field, obviously water is constrained, and it's known that the relative permittivity of water on an electrode surface is low. And the most recent values have suggested that the relative permittivity of water on a graphene surface at least could be as low as 2. So even though it's a very simple analysis, we're getting numbers that are, perhaps consistent with more sophisticated analysis that people have done of the graphite, or graphene in that case, water interface. There is another interpretation, because we've only considered basically these differences in capacitance due to the difference in size of the ions, but a paper came out last year which reevaluated our data on these specific ion effects and capacitance, and that's this paper here from this American group, which appeared in Nature Communications, and they basically explained or rationalized these differences in capacitance for the different alkali metals on, I think in their case, they were using graphene as the electrode material rather than graphite, as being partly due to the things that we've essentially talked about, partly due to different absorption of the ion, which comes from different ease of dehydration. But also, this American group concluded that it was a charge transfer, that the larger ions could undergo partial charge transfer from the electrode surface. So what we think of as a capacitance is in fact more like a pseudo-capacitance, because there's a partially Faradaic component to the so-called capacitive behavior that we're seeing. So all this to say that there are specific ion effects, so different ions give different capacitive responses on graphite and graphene surfaces, and I don't think these effects have been studied in a great amount of detail. There's a lot more to be done to understand these phenomena, I think. Just to say also, that was all about basal plane graphite. There's been a lot of work in the 1980s and 1990s on edge plane graphite, because the edge plane of graphite is a good substrate onto which you can absorb biological molecules. So there's a lot of work on so-called protein film voltammetry from people like Fraser Armstrong, where they absorb electron transfer proteins onto the edge plane of graphite surfaces. And the problem with that's very interesting work, but again, I would say the more fundamental properties of the graphite edge plane are not well understood. For example, if you look at the capacitance values quoted for the graphite edge plane, using two of the names I've already given, Jaeger and McCreary, Jaeger gives values of about 60 microfarads per square centimeter, whereas according to McCreary, the edge plane capacitance is more like 150 microfarads per square centimeter. So there's a huge disparity in the reported values. Same with the contact angle of water on the edge plane. We only found one literature value, and that was about 56 degrees. Whereas when we tried to measure this ourselves, and this is the paper that our specific ion capacitance data was published in, we got a much higher value. We got the contact angle of about 140 degrees. So basically there's big inconsistencies in the kind of fairly fundamental data of the properties of the edge plane electrolyte interface. Now, part of this is because the edge plane is much harder to prepare in a uniform way, if you like. So it's harder to get an edge plane that's got a defined surface area with very reproducible surface chemistry, because it will kind of depend much more on the sample itself and on the history of the sample. So that's part of the reason for these discrepancies. But again, this is always to emphasize that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to understand the properties of both the basal plane and edge plane of graphitic materials. So if I move on slightly, going back to the basal plane, we can connect the capacitance data that I talked about with the wetting data that I talked about. If I return to this configuration that I've already mentioned, which is when you have a droplet of electrolyte solution and you inject it onto basal plane graphite. So here's the droplet, here's the basal plane graphite, and the reason for the reflection is because the basal plane is acting as a mirror. So this is just a mirror reflecting what you have here, the droplet and the pipette where the liquid was injected from. And if we use our basal plane graphite as a working electrode, and we have both a reference and a counter electrode inside the pipette, then we can obviously apply a potential, to that graphite, and we can measure the contact angle, which is the initial value for the uncharged surface is about 64 or so degrees, plus or minus 2 perhaps degrees. We can measure the change in contact angle as we apply a potential to that graphite surface. And you can see that you get a nice classical electro-wetting effect. The contact angle changes from the initial value of 60 degrees, 64 degrees or something like that, to down to about 10 degrees at quite low voltages. This is only going up to about 1 volt positive of the PZC on this graphite surface. And the reason graphite is very good, you get this very strong electro-wetting of water on graphite. There's two reasons for it. One, because we have a macroscopically smooth surface, you can cleave basal plane graphite and get, if it's a good quality material, you'll get a basal plane that's free of large steps and defects, so the droplet doesn't get pinned as it expands. And the second reason is because graphite is relatively hydrophobic. So when we inject the water onto the graphite, the contact angle isn't too low. So we're already starting from a relatively high contact angle, which decreases as we do the electro-wetting experiment. And you can see that this effect is, this effect is fairly reversible. You can see the change in the contact angle as we apply the potential. And basically, we can do this over many cycles. We can do this over hundreds of cycles. The contact angle is completely reversible over this potential range. And just to emphasize that we think, at least, this is a capacitively driven phenomenon because we're in a range of potentials where we have little or no Faradaic effects going on. So we think that this is purely driven by the change in the capacitance of the interface. That's what drives the contact angle. And then we can do a standard Young-Lippmann analysis. This type of electro-wetting has been known for many years. We can independently measure using impedance. We can measure the capacitance of the interface as a function of potential of the graphite electrode. And we can plot from the Young-Lippmann analysis basically the change in the contact angle or the cosine of the contact angle should be a function of this parameter called the electro-wetting number, which depends on three things. It depends on the potential you apply, it depends on the capacitance of the interface, which we know from the impedance, and it depends on the surface tension of the water vapor interface. So we put those parameters in, and that gives us a solid line. Here is what we should see for the change in contact angle if if the wetting effect were purely capacitively driven, and the dotted lines are what we actually see. So the agreement isn't perfect. It's not too bad at low potentials, but you can see at higher potentials, the model isn't correct. So some parameter, perhaps the capacitance measurements, are out because at higher potentials, we see a lower change in contact angle than the theory would predict. So this is something that we're still working on. And also, as I mentioned, because we think the capacitance of the graphite interface is sensitive to these specific ion effects, we really want to look at how this capacitive phenomenon changes as we change the identity and the concentration of the ion. So just to change subject slightly again, I've been talking for the last 10 minutes or so, these capacitance data was always done at quite high electrolyte concentrations, sort of 5 or 6 molar, so we could eliminate diffuse double layer effects from our calculations of capacitance. But we were interested in a paper that came out 5 years ago in Science, where they talked about you doing something which seems a bit crazy when you first think about it, which is making a lithium-ion battery operate in aqueous solution. How do you do that? How do you get lithium to integrate in graphite using water as your solvent? And what these guys did, this is from a group from the a US Army lab, I think it is. They developed a so-called water in salt concept. So the idea is quite simple if you think about it. If you have a very high concentration of salt, so there isn't enough water to solvate the salt properly, then the thermodynamic activity of the water decreases, and basically it becomes hard, if you like, kinetically, to oxidize and reduce the water to do the hydrogen and or the oxygen and the hydrogen evolution reactions. So you extend the potential window of the water to such an extent that you can intercalate lithium into graphite, even though your solvent is water. And they use some organic solvent at very high concentration, I think about 20 molar. But we found that some of the simple alkali metal halide salts are actually soluble to almost those concentrations. For example, potassium fluoride, which is the salt that Graham used for a lot of his work on mercury in the 1940s, is in fact soluble in water at room temperature up to 17 molar. So we started looking at the capacitive response of graphite electrodes, basal plane graphite, as a function of Kf concentration. And here is the graphs. The numbers might not be very clear, so I'll just talk you through them. But here we have, this is the capacitance as a function of potential. This is for 0.5 molar Kf. And then now we're just increasing as we go from left to right, and then in the second row as well, increasing the Kf concentration. So this is 0.5 molar, this is 1 molar, this is number one on the right, I'm getting it to move. It's 5 molar. Here we have, bottom left, we have 10 molar. Here we have 13 molar, and here we've gone up to the solubility limit. This is 17 molar. And you can see two things. If you look at the capacitance values, they don't change too much. You know, we're typically in the range of 5 microfarads here. We go up to like 10 microfarads per square centimeter here. So the capacitance doesn't change too much. But the thing that does change enormously is the potential range, because we're only recording the capacitance over regions where the impedance response looks purely capacitive. So at the low concentrations, that's only over about 1 volt. Then you start to get into some kind of oxidation or reduction reaction. But at the high concentrations, once you go above 10 molar particularly, that potential range extends to about 3 volts, which essentially is entirely consistent with what these guys were reporting, that you can basically massively massively extend the potential window of water by having a very high concentration of salt. So it's quite an interesting experiment, and you see all sorts of strange phenomena, I think, working at these very high electrolyte concentrations. So that's the capacitive response. If we can even do a simple CV experiment, as I've kind of mentioned before, the ferro-ferrocyanide redox couple does not behave that well on basal plane graphite. You know, as I talked about with the data I presented from Unwin's group, you know, it's not a very reversible couple, at least after a few cycles. You see a fairly messy response. And so here we're showing the ferrocyanide couple, just a simple macroscopic CV on basal plane graphite. Again, same concentration of the redox active molecule, but increasing the concentration of Kf. So we'll go from 0.5 molar to the same concentrations as I showed you just before, 1 molar, 5 molar, 10 molar, 13 molar, and 17 molar. And you can see two things. Firstly, if you look at the current scale, it's decreased, or this current density we're measuring here, but it's decreased by an order of magnitude. It's gone from 6,000 microfarads per square centimeter to 600 microfarads per square centimeter. That's easy to explain. Obviously, as we add more and more salt, the solution becomes more and more viscous, so the transport of the molecules slows down, so therefore, hence the reduction in current. But the other thing that changes is the quality of the CV. We get these CVs that look quite messy, not exactly electrochemically reversible, and with a shoulder in them at the low electrolyte concentrations. But those CVs become much more reversible, and the shoulder disappears as we go to the highest electrolyte concentrations. We get really pretty, sort of more or less classical voltammetric responses by going to these very high electrolyte concentrations. And we can do some sort of standard analysis on these CV responses. We can do a sort of potential step experiments to extract the diffusion coefficient using a Cottrell type analysis, and you can see the reduction in the diffusion coefficient, from the Cottrell gradient as we go from the low to the high electrolyte concentration. And we can also extract the apparent heterogeneous rate constant, standard rate constant for electron transfer from a simple CV analysis, which you can see goes up by an order of magnitude as we increase the concentration of the KF. And basically, though it does fall at the highest electrolyte concentration, but the basic message is that the system becomes much more reversible at these high electrolyte concentrations than it is at the low electrolyte concentrations. And this has kind of been reported before. There was some work, again, coincidentally, from Heinz Gerischer with Laurie Peter, when Laurie Peter was a postdoc in the 1970s. And they looked at this phenomenon, at least at the lower electrolyte concentrations, and they saw something similar. And they rationalized it, which our data is consistent with an ion pairing. The electron transfer is actually dependent on an ion pairing between the ferrocyanide and the potassium, and that's why you get this apparent electrolyte dependence, electrolyte concentration dependence of the electron transfer kinetics. But if we go a bit further, it's actually quite interesting to look at the diffusion coefficients, to turn those diffusion coefficients, again, just doing a very simple analysis, turning those diffusion coefficients we get from the potential step experiments into the apparent viscosity of the solutions, because obviously we can compare the viscosity of these electrolyte solutions just using a viscometer. And what you see from a viscometer is just a kind of straight line. Okay, this is a logarithmic plot of viscosity, but you can see that on the logarithmic scale, the viscosity increases steadily as we increase the electrolyte concentration from sort of 0 to 17 molar. But when you compare that kind of macroscopic viscosity with the microscopic viscosity you extract from the electrochemical experiments, you can see that the viscosity, or the apparent viscosity on a kind of microscopic level, doesn't change very much at the low electrolyte concentrations. But when you get to the high electrolyte concentrations, the viscosity changes massively. It goes up by kind of not 1, but 2 or even 3 orders of magnitude for these highest electrolyte concentrations. So why is that? What's the difference between the viscosity on the macroscopic level of the solution as a fluid moving through the viscometer and the redox probe moving through this electrolyte solution? Why are you measuring two different things? And one reason, I think, is, which I've alluded to already, that the molecule, because it's charged, because we're using a charged redox active species, it becomes heavily ion paired at these high electrolyte concentrations. So the thing that's actually moving through the solution is much larger than the thing that's moving through the solution than at the low concentrations. So this is kind of an artifact of the ion pairing, that we're seeing this massive change in the apparent local viscosity at these high concentrations. But I think these effects are still very interesting, and I think that I'm really surprised at how little literature there is, that I've been able to find at least, on just really basic electrochemical experiments on these highly concentrated aqueous electrolyte solutions. And again, just to come back to the surface contamination, as I've said before, if you measure ferricyanide on basal plane graphite, the first CV might look okay, but rapidly it looks horrible. The first CV doesn't look that great, but after a while of repeated cycling, you get something that looks distinctly weird at normal electrolyte concentrations. Whereas if we do the same thing, same redox couple, ferricyanide redox couple, but instead of using a sort of more classical electrolyte concentration of 0.5 molar, we work at 17 molar, you can see that not only is the CV much more reversible, as I've already talked about, but it's entirely reproducible. Even the 100th scan more or less completely overlays the first scan. So all these contamination effects, whether they're from the molecule itself or from contaminants from the atmosphere diffusing through the aqueous solution, they are completely suppressed by going to these very high electrolyte concentrations. So you've changed completely the nature, the structure of the electrode-electrolyte interface at these very high electrolyte concentrations. So I'm just conscious of time. I've got one more slide on these high concentration electrolytes, then I'll move on very quickly to some experiments on graphene in the last 5 minutes. So basically, just the last thing to say about the properties of these highly concentrated electrolyte solutions. We couldn't find, maybe other people are able to find this, but we couldn't find any literature on the contact angle dependence of, the dependence of contact angle on electrolyte concentration. And maybe that's because at low concentrations, it's not very interesting. Basically, if you have this is the experiment I like, my favorite non-electrochemical experiment is to put a droplet of something on graphite and measure its contact angle. So if it's pure water, as I said, in air, the contact angle is 60 something degrees. And if you start adding electrolyte, KF, to that aqueous solution, the contact angle hardly changes, which is probably why people haven't really bothered with this before. At the low electrolyte concentrations, the change is hardly bigger than experimental error. So I could understand why people have thought this was too boring to measure. If you go to quite high electrolyte concentrations, once you get to 5 molar, you do see a change in contact angle, which is significant, much bigger than experimental error. It does change by sort of 10 or 15 degrees when you get up to 5 or 10 molar. But the weird thing is, when you get to these very high electrolyte concentrations, where basically the ions are closer than the Bjerrum length, you don't have enough water around the ions to solvate the ions properly. So the ions are interacting with each other in very weird ways, and that means the contact angle changes massively and goes above 90 degrees even at the highest electrolyte concentrations. So basically the droplet de-wets from the graphite surface. And physically, it's easy to understand why this is. There isn't enough water to solvate the ions properly, so the water doesn't spread over the surface. And again, I've not been able to find any literature on, maybe it exists, but I've not found it, on contact angles of these very concentrated electrolyte solutions. And we reported all this highly concentrated behavior in a recent paper in Chemical Science, if you're interested in reading about this in more detail. So last topic I'd just like to mention, I won't get on to talking about liquid-liquid, but just a little bit, a couple of minutes on graphene. Again, I've mainly been talking about interactions of ions with graphite surfaces, and the interest in this field recently has been driven by a parallel interest, if you like, on interaction of ions with graphene. And one of the applications of that area is that it's easy to make graphene oxide dispersions. And graphene oxide disperses well in water, but then you can filter it. You can filter the graphene oxide dispersion through some polymer membrane or whatever, and the graphene oxide will restack to form a membrane of its own. And the interesting thing about these membranes is that the capillaries that form between the restacked graphene oxide are about a nanometer or a little bit less in diameter. So in principle, they're about the same as the size of hydrated ions. So a lot of people got excited about 5 years ago and the idea that you could use graphene oxide as a desalination membrane. Basically, graphene oxide is hydrophilic, so water would pass through it easily, but it would sieve out ions, and therefore you could turn salt water into fresh water. There's only one problem. Graphene oxide is so hydrophilic that it swells. So the problem is that graphene oxide can be used for desalination as long as you don't get it wet. So there's a paradox there, and nobody's really resolved that paradox very successfully. But we're interested in using other 2D materials for these type of applications. In fact, we've done some work recently on molybdenum disulfide, which is very promising in this context. I won't talk about that here, but we've also done some work on graphene rather than graphene oxide, which obviously is less hydrophilic than graphene oxide, but it's not prone to swelling. So you don't have the swelling problem with graphene membranes. And then you can do the simple experiment where you look at potential induced transfer. If you have 2 electrolyte solutions on either side of your graphene membrane, you can look at the current voltage response of that graphene membrane. And so here's a picture of the graphene membrane, which is we've made by filtering it onto a polymer support, and this is entirely flexible because it consists of lots of graphene flakes. The membranes themselves are several microns thick, but obviously they correspond to thousands of layers of individual graphene platelets, which are restacked. And you can look at the current voltage response of these graphene membranes. And what you see at high concentrations, you can obviously measure the effective conductance of the membrane. At high concentrations, the conductance is dominated by the bulk electrolyte solution. So you decrease the solution concentration, the conductance falls. But it falls to a minimum value because at some point, the conductance doesn't become dictated by the concentration of the electrolyte, it becomes dictated by the charge on the membrane itself. So you move from bulk controlled conductivity to surface controlled conductivity. And where you get that transition depends on the size of the platelets that are used to form the membrane. Basically, if you use smaller platelets, they have more edge, and therefore they have a higher surface charge, and therefore the transition from bulk to surface conductivity occurs at higher concentrations. And we can do a sort of, if we have an asymmetric concentration of electrolytes on either side of that membrane, we can look at the current voltage response for these different graphene membranes formed from different sizes of graphene platelets and do a kind of standard Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz analysis to extract the apparent mobilities or the mobility ratio of the ions moving across that membrane, because you always get this offset in the zero current potential, so you can relate that to the mobility ratio of the ions that are present in the salt. So you can get quite a lot of information from doing some quite simple experiments in this kind of drift diffusion configuration. And basically, to cut a long story short, you can measure the mobility ratio of ions in the membrane and look at how the transport of different ions through these graphene channels is suppressed relative to the transfer of chloride ions. So all ions are transported more slowly through the membranes, but basically, as you might expect, ions of higher charge are attenuated more as they travel through the membrane. So that's the type of analysis we've been doing, looking at to get information on transport of ions through graphene membranes. So just to conclude, because I think I've talked for long enough. So the take-home message is that the water at graphite surfaces has got, I think, does very interesting things, which I don't think are very well understood. The electrochemical behavior, because graphite is a conductor, you can use electrochemistry, both Faradaic electrochemistry and capacitive responses, to try to understand what's going on at these interfaces. There's a lot of interesting capacitive effects, which I think I'm really surprised how poorly understood it seems to me that they are, especially because if you think about all the applications of high surface area carbons, that, removing heavy metals and from aqueous solutions and so on, you'd think that the energetics of ion adsorption on carbon surfaces would be well understood, but as far as I can see, it's not, at least from an experimental point of view. And just another point to make is that these highly concentrated aqueous electrolyte solutions behave in quite unexpected ways, and particularly, although graphite becomes, as I've tried to emphasize, becomes rapidly contaminated, and the electrochemical response of graphite is basically very sensitive to this contamination in aqueous solutions. Working at these highly concentrated, solutions really stops this contamination. So something completely different is happening at these interfaces when you have a high salt concentration. So just finally thank Mihail for organizing this series of lectures. I've managed to attend about half of them, and I've really enjoyed the ones that I've seen. I'd like to thank current members of my group whose work has been shown here, current and previous members of my group whose work has been shown here, and collaborators from a couple of different departments in Manchester. And thank you finally for your attention.